Guys, David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest is structured as a fractal, and more specifically, a Sierpinski triangle. And if you look at the screen right now, this is akin to the modeling that Wallace used with Sierpinski triangles while he was writing Infinite Jest. And on slide number 1, we have the plot and characters laid out in a Sierpinski triangle. And on slide number 2, we have the themes of Infinite Jest laid out in a Sierpinski triangle. And to go over all this would require hours and hours and a full breakdown of Infinite Jest. So that's what I'm going to do free on YouTube starting tomorrow. A full chapter by chapter breakdown of Infinite Jest, fractal by fractal, triangle by triangle, because writeconscious is the headquarters of David Foster Wallace content on YouTube. And this video today is an introduction to the fractal nature of Infinite Jest. We will first be hearing from Wallace about why and how he structured Infinite Jest as a fractal. And then I'll be breaking down after that what he said in a more simplistic context, because the interviewer actually drives an air into the conversation that Wallace doesn't correct because he is a very kind guy. And so I want to, before we move on and do a 10-hour breakdown of Infinite Jest, have that all laid out, our axiomatic structure of Infinite Jest as a fractal, so that we can build it, as I said earlier, triangle by triangle. So subscribe if you guys are interested in an Infinite Jest breakdown, and we are now going to hear from Wallace.
It occurred to me that the way in which the material is presented allows for a subject to be announced in a small form. Then there seems to be a fan of subject matter, other subjects, and then it comes back in a second form containing the other subjects in small, and then comes back again as if what were being described were, and I don't know this kind of science, but it just, I said to myself, this must be fractals.
I've heard you were an acute reader. That's one of the things structurally that's going on. It's actually structured like something called a Sierpinski gasket, which is a very primitive kind of pyramidical fractal. Although what was structured as a Sierpinski gasket was the first was the draft that I delivered to Michael in '94, and it went through some, I think, mercy cuts. So it's probably kind of a lopsided Sierpinski gasket now. But it's interesting. That's one of the structural ways that it's supposed to kind of come together.
Michael is Michael Peach, the editor at Little Brown. What is a Sierpinski gasket?
It would be almost. I would almost have to show you. It's kind of a design that a man named Sierpinski, I believe, developed. It was quite a bit before the introduction of fractals, and before any of the kind of technologies that fractals are a real useful metaphor for. But it looks basically like a pyramid on acid, with certain interconnections between parts of them that are visually kind of astonishing, and then the mathematical explanations of them are interesting.
All I really know about fractals comes from an essay by Hugh Kenner, who leapt up and said, "Oh, Pound did this." And he was trying to suggest that the ways in which material is organized in poetry and elsewhere is extremely unsophisticated, that the patterns of disorder are much more beautiful than the patterns of order, and equally discoverable. When you structure a book in this way, do you mean it to be discovered?
Yeah, that's a very tricky question, because I know that when I was a young writer, I would play endless sort of structural games that I think, in retrospect, were mostly for myself alone and didn't much care. I don't really... I mean, Infinite Jest is trying to do a whole bunch of different things at once, and it doesn't make much difference to me whether somebody... I mean, I would expect that somebody who's a mathematician or a logician or an ACS guy might be interested in some of the fractal structures of it. For me, I mean, a lot of the motivation had to do with, it seems to me that so much of premillennial life in America consists of enormous amounts of what seem like discrete bits of information coming, and that the real kind of intellectual adventure is finding ways to relate them to each other and to find larger patterns and meanings, which of course is essentially narrative, but that structurally it's a bit different. And since fractals are a more kind of Oh Lord, since its chaos is more on the surface, sort of its bones or its beauty, a little bit more. That would be a more interesting way to structure the thing. Okay, now I'm meandering, but I know that I know that for doing something this long, a fair amount of the structural stuff is for me, because it's kind of like, pitons in the mountainside. I mean, it's ways for me to stay oriented and engaged and get through it. I don't think I would impose weird structures on the reader the way I would have, say, 10 years ago. Does that make any sense?
Yes, it does,
Okay.
but I wanted to suggest, at least for me, that the organization of the material, whether or not someone leaps up and says fractal or even has heard of fractals, seemed to me to be necessary and beautiful, because we're entering a world that needs to be made strange before it becomes familiar. And so it seemed to me that in this book, which contains both the banality and extraordinariness of various kinds of experience, and the banality of extraordinary experience as well, that
And the extraordinariness of banal experience.
yeah, that a way needed to be found, and it thrilled me that it seemed to be structural, that the book found a way to arrange itself so that one knew, for the longest time you would be faced with these analogies. When Ulysses came out, people talked about its musical structures. When Dos Passos' books came out, people talked about film editing.
Mm-hmm.
It seems very hard in the last period of years to find a new way to structure a book. The only thing that I know is Barth working with logarithmic spirals to deal with the unfoldings of memory and of seeing things from new perspective at later dates.
You got to realize, though, when you're talking to somebody who's actually written the thing, there's this weird Monday morning quarterbacking thing about it, because I know that, at least for me, I mean, I don't sit down to try to, let's see, how can I find a suitable, structural synecdoche for experience right now? It's more a matter of kind of whether it tastes true or not. And I know that this is the first thing I ever did that I took money for before it was done, because I just didn't have any money and I wanted to finish it. And Michael Peach, the editor, said, I think he got like the first 400 pages, and he said it seemed to him like a piece of glass that had been dropped from a great height. And that was the first time that anybody had ever conceptualized what was, to me, just a certain structural representation of the way the world kind of operated on my nerve endings, which was as a bunch of discrete random bits, but which contained within them, not always all that latently, very interesting connections. And it wasn't clear whether the connections were my own imagination and were crazy, or whether they were real and what were important and what weren't. And so, I mean, a lot of the structure in there is kind of seat of the pants, what kind of felt true to me and what didn't. I did not sit down with, I'm going to do a fractal structure or something. I don't think I'm that kind of writer.
So there aren't diagrams, or the diagrams emerged as you went along?
Well, I've got a poster of a Sierpinski gasket that I've had since I was a little boy that I like just because it's pretty. But it's real weird. I mean, I think writing is a big blend of, there's a lot of sophistication and there's a lot of kind of idiocy about it. And so much of it is gut. And this feels true, this doesn't feel true, this tastes right, this doesn't. And it's only when you get about halfway through that I think you start to see any sort of structure emerging at all. Then, of course,
So if you look at the screen right now, we have a gasket or a Sierpinski triangle. And if you double a Sierpinski triangle, it doesn't double or double or anything like that, like all the other shapes do. Rather, something in between happens. You get 3 copies in the middle, as depicted here. And so this is very important to move us away from Michael Silverblatt. And Michael Silverblatt was the interviewer who was talking about the fractals. And if we look at this quote from Kyle McCarthy in an article on Infinite Jest, it says, quote, "The best novels already have a fractionalized quality. Each chapter, and indeed every paragraph and sentence, reproduce in miniature its central conflict and arc." And so when we look at Silverblatt's theory, he was saying that fractals in Infinite Jest are existing as like a foreshadowing element. They come in and announce themselves, as he said, But when we look back at the triangle, you can see that every replication of the triangle is replicating the whole of what's already there. And so that creates an infinite jest, an infinite interconnectivity within the novel, which is much more akin to what's happening, like I said, as their fractals being structured as a foreshadowing event, what's going to happen in the next fractal. And so I think it would be amiss to say, because we heard Wallace say, I didn't sit down and plot out a Sierpinski gasket when I was writing Infinite Jest, but that when he had it on his wall and he was imagining the doubling, imagining these things happening, and with that, that's what gave life to the structure, to the concept, and that was the guiding force for Infinite Jest, which I think is so beautiful, because that really does capture what you could say postmodernism and reality is about, unless you're living in a cave. And what makes Infinite Jest so beautiful is that it transcends fractal structure and the Sierpinski triangle, and it creates its own logic. By the end of the novel, it has become its own fractal. It's become its own thing, because it's just been doubling its entire time. And that's why we can study it. That's why we can sit here and do these major analyses of it, because it is its own universe now. So what can you guys add to this? Because of course, we are going to be diving much deeper over the coming months into Infinite Jest and all this fractal stuff. But if you guys would like to share your thoughts down below, I'd love to read them. Tell me what I missed, because I will be reading them and it may help me in the future as I'm building out this Infinite Jest course/breakdown. So thank you guys for being here, and see you guys soon.